It's the weekend, so I can spend a few more hours getting some bits and pieces done on this car. And the first thing I'm going to look at is getting the engine and gearbox sorted out and get it ready to go into the car. So the deal with this engine is it came out of a rally car that was a 93 or 94 WRX. It was actually a Japanese car that was imported into Australia and was rallied. The engine was rebuilt in this car a few years ago, and the car changed owners and got rolled quite heavily. However, the engine and the driveline, the gearbox and everything was undamaged and was in good condition. So we're going to reuse this engine and gearbox and everything into the new Rally Sprint car. However, the Rally Sprint car is a 98 shell, and this is a 93 or version 1 engine, version 1 or version 2 engine. And there's a few differences with that. So basically we've got to use the complete wiring loom, the dash and ECU and a few other bits and pieces, intercooler and everything, out of the 93 or the version 1 car to make it all work without having to rewire everything and change everything over. Subaru pretty much used this same setup from the Liberty RS or the Legacy RS, depending where you are in the world, all the way through to 96. So basically it's got what they call the low-rise manifold on it, where the inlet for the turbo actually comes in from the back of the inlet manifold rather than going underneath the manifold. That's one way to tell the difference in the engines. Also, the manifold height is actually lower, has a different power steering pump on it as well, and some of the engine electrics, plus the coils are actually on the side of the engine rather than being on a coil pack on the top of the engine or just offset on the manifold, which some of the later cars had in the GC series. And then obviously when they went to GD, they must have thought the coil-on plug was a great idea, because they've gone back to putting coils back on the plugs again. Engine block and the basic setups are still the EJ20, the Boxer engine. These engines are not a bad little donk. They run quite reliably. They've got hydraulic lifters in them rather than solid lifters. However, for what we want it for, this thing will run perfectly. Now, surprising for a rally car, for some odd reason, the air conditioner compressor was still on. I don't know if the air conditioning was actually working in the old rally car that was in there. So we'll get rid of that today, tidy this all up and neaten it up. The power steering pump on this was also very noisy when it was in the last rally car, and the tank on top is actually dented. So I'd say that in the rollover that's copped a knock, or maybe when it's got pulled out of the car, one way or the other that's going to go. I'll actually put a later model power steering pump on it, and I'll use the later model lines, because the power steering lines also changed on these to suit the pumps and the inlets and everything as well. Also, we'll drop the exhaust off. At the moment the dump pipe's still onto the turbo. We'll take that all off, and then the engine and gearbox, we'll get that back together, flywheel, clutch, everything back in, made it all together and get it ready to go. Actually bolt it onto the cross member, get the transmission cross member and the engine cross member all sorted out, and then put it all in the car as one piece, put it up through pick it up through the bottom, which is the way that the Subaru manufactured the cars in the first place. Just makes it much easier to have it all assembled in one unit and then get it all back in the car and bolt it in. All this caper's got to come off the front. Now already I can see a slight problem here. These particular bolts are M10 bolts, I think, and normally the power steering pump is bolted in with M8 bolts. So something's happened here already. They've in the block, the threads have been stripped or something. So before I put a new power steering pump on there, I will get a tap through those and clean those up. That one doesn't seem to be too bad. But this one here, yeah, not ideal. I don't know why that's happened. At some point somebody stripped the threads on that, so that's not the end of the world. We'll sort that out. Yeah, don't need air conditioning in this rally car, so we'll definitely do away with that. As a quick check, I'm just going to drop the timing cover off the left side of the engine here and have a quick squiz inside there. There shouldn't be anything untoward. This engine was rebuilt and hasn't done a lot of kilometres since it was rebuilt. However, I just want to have peace of mind that everything looks alright in there and the timing marks are okay. Yeah, it's got all new pulleys in it, which I would have expected. I know the guys that rebuilt this engine, it wasn't done by us. But, it looks pretty good. Just to make sure that nothing has transpired in there. The belt hasn't jumped any teeth or anything, but it's got a good belt in it. I can see all the timing marks have all been done in there. And I know after the car was rolled, it was started. And it ran okay. It did spend a fair bit of time upside down before it went back on its wheels, and the oil levels were checked and everything and whatever. Condition of the turbo, hopefully that's okay. Dropping the dump pipe off this because it'll make it easier to get it in the car. They actually did pretty well to pull the engine out of that car. We didn't pull the engine out. It's pulled out by somebody else, and they actually did pretty well to get the dump pipe out without actually we'll get the engine out with the dump pipe on it without damaging that, so that's pretty good. And thankfully it looks like I think this might have had a new turbo on it when the engine was rebuilt, but thankfully none of the bolts are rounded. I've had quite a few of these engines where somebody's changed a turbo or pulled a turbo off for some reason, and all of these bolts down here are rounded, particularly the one right underneath the bottom of the turbo, which is a bit of a pain in the ass to get at. This is a very common thing with Subarus of this era. Basically, from the up pipe that comes from the headers or the exhaust manifolds at the bottom up to the turbo, the heat shield on it, they've only got a tiny couple of spot welds that hold them on, and those spot welds break with vibrations and then they rattle, and it's very common for cars to come in with this with a strange rattling noise in the exhaust. It can't quite pinpoint, and it's usually there. When it's in the car, it's not so easy to get at. It's sort of tucked up right up the back there. You can sort of weld it in the car. That if you like getting a shower of spatter and sparks, you can weld them up. What I'll do is probably just put a couple of spots of weld on that later on, just to hold that in place, and probably a couple of tacks on the bottom. The most important part with these is to make sure that the actual bracing to the engine for the top of the up pipe is actually all the brackets are in and they're all bolted in tight, which I've checked those, they're all good on this, which is great, because it's quite common also for the up pipe to crack. It's like a crinkle cut chip in there, like an oven baked crinkle cut chip. It wasn't the best design. They didn't use a flex joint. Obviously they did it because it was cheap and easy in production back in the 90s, and that pipe in there tends to crack and break if there's too much vibration, either from the exhaust manifolds at the bottom or the turbo at the top, and then that splits and then you get an exhaust leak, you lose boost, it sounds horrible, and it's a bit of a prick of a job to change it. And thankfully for a change, these are all not over tightened. Okay, let's have a look at this turbine wheel. Beautiful. That's actually pretty good in there. There's no play in that at all. So that's an encouraging sign. It's quite clean in the turbine housing, which is also good. There's no oil in there. I'm pretty confident that turbo will be okay. In the meantime, we'll get the clutch on the engine. Without a clutch aligning to it, we'll do this the old school way. Popping up. what we'll do is just make sure the clutch is engaged. Some leverage on this, and beautiful. That's it. Okay, that's the back one in. So very productive, good day. Had Mark round giving me a bit of a hand as well, which helped out a lot. Some of the work we didn't record. There were times when we had stripped and rounded bolts to deal with, and there was some pretty average welding I found on the cross member for the sump guard, so had to sort that out and get that all cleaned up as well, degreasing the sump guard. You know, other bits and pieces that were pretty boring that we didn't film. However, got the engine and gearbox in the car, which is the most important part. Got it all in, got it back together, and everything is ready to go. Still quite a few bits and pieces to go on there, like power steering pump and lines, steering rack and things like that. I was going to put the rack in today, discovered a split boot on the steering rack, so I'll change that boot, or maybe even replace the rack with another spare one we've got, put that all back together and get on with it, connecting up all the other bits and pieces. Of course, there's still all the electrics and the plumbing and cooling system and everything to do. That'll happen in due course. Really, from here on in, we'll do bits and pieces now, but it's waiting on the cage to arrive, and then we can get busy welding that all in and get on with the rest of it. I'd just like to say, recently I was at a rally presentation dinner, got a lot of comments, positive feedback from people saying they loved the videos and were following the progress of the build. So thank you very much for that. That support is great and inspires us to keep making these videos and to keep putting content up on the channel. So if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and we'll catch you again for the next episode. Cheers.